He would later say the first warning sign was not the money, it was the silence. The email arrived at 2:17 a.m. No greeting, no branding, just a secure link and a request. Executive culinary position, immediate travel required, discretion mandatory. For a chef whose once promising restaurant had folded under mounting debt, the message felt like oxygen. He had trained in classical French technique, staged in Michelin-level kitchens, and built a reputation for sourcing rare ingredients with scientific precision. But reputation does not pay suppliers. Investors had withdrawn, rent had accumulated, the dining room that once filled with applause had gone dark. So when the invitation came, he answered. The interview was not held in a restaurant, hotel, or corporate office. It took place inside a private aviation terminal outside the city, a location used by individuals who preferred to avoid arrival boards and camera phones. He was instructed not to bring a phone. Upon arrival, his identification was photographed, scanned, and returned without comment. Two representatives met him in a glass conference room overlooking the runway. They did not offer surnames. They did not describe their employer directly. Instead, they described expectations: travel without notice, zero social media presence, absolute confidentiality, no questions about guests. The compensation package was printed on a single sheet of paper. The base salary alone exceeded what his restaurant had grossed in its best quarter. Housing provided, security clearance required, a non-disclosure agreement that extended indefinitely. He asked about the client. The response was measured: ultra-high net worth individuals who value culinary privacy. Privacy, not luxury, not prestige, privacy. He was told he would oversee private dining experiences for a rotating circle of global elites. Financiers, technology magnates, industrial heirs. The gatherings would take place on secured estates, yachts, and remote properties inaccessible to the public. He would be responsible for menu development, ingredient integrity, and execution under absolute discretion. The questions they asked him were unusual. Not about flavor profiles, not about plating aesthetics. They asked how comfortable he was preparing proteins without standard supply chain documentation. They asked whether he trusted his palate more than paperwork. They asked how loyal he considered himself. He answered carefully. Precision was his discipline. Adaptability was survival. Before he left the room, the contract was slid across the table. The NDA alone spanned dozens of pages, outlining financial penalties severe enough to erase him professionally. He hesitated only briefly before signing. As he walked back across the quiet terminal, a private jet taxied toward the runway. Its windows were dark, no passengers visible, no airline markings. He told himself this was opportunity. Reinvention. A second act. What he did not know was that the interview had not been about his cooking. It had been about his limits. And somewhere behind the polished professionalism of that room, behind the neutral expressions and controlled language, something had already begun assessing how far he would go, and what he would do once he understood exactly what he had agreed to prepare. The coordinates were sent 1 hour before departure. No street name, no landmark, just numbers. He boarded the jet just after dawn. The cabin interior was quiet, almost sterile. No logos, no flight announcements. Even the crew avoided unnecessary conversation. His contract had instructed him to travel light. One suitcase, knives packed separately, inspected and sealed. Through the oval window, the city dissolved into farmland, then into stretches of undeveloped land broken only by narrow roads that appeared to lead nowhere. When the plane descended, there was no visible airport terminal, only a private runway cut into a remote landscape bordered by thick forest. A black SUV waited at the edge of the tarmac. The driver did not introduce himself. The road from the runway curved through miles of wooded terrain before iron gates emerged from behind a bend. There were no signs, no estate name engraved in stone, just reinforced steel doors embedded into walls too high to scale without equipment. The gates opened before the vehicle fully stopped. Inside, the estate unfolded with deliberate precision, expansive lawns trimmed to mathematical accuracy, architecture that blended old-world stonework with modern reinforced glass. The structure was not built to impress passers-by. There were none. It was built to exist unseen. Security was layered. cameras positioned at angles that left no blind spots, guards wearing discreet earpieces, biometric scanners at interior checkpoints. He was issued a temporary identification band upon entry, coded to allow access only to designated areas. The kitchen complex sat separate from the main dining hall. Industrial in scale, immaculate in design. Stainless steel surfaces reflected light from recessed fixtures. Refrigeration units lined one wall, labeled in numerical sequence, each section cataloged with digital logs. He met the core staff in brief introductions: a pastry specialist, two sous chefs, a procurement liaison. None offered personal histories. Their expressions carried a shared understanding. This was not a place for casual curiosity. He conducted his first inventory review within the hour. Imported Wagyu, rare truffles, caviar varieties unavailable to standard distributors, exotic game meats vacuum sealed and tagged with shipment codes he did not immediately recognize. Everything appeared legitimate, if extraordinarily exclusive. Then he noticed one refrigeration unit isolated from the others. No country of origin labels, no agricultural certifications, no supplier branding. Just a numeric code. When he inquired, the procurement liaison responded smoothly. Specialty stock, delivered separately, cleared through private channels. Private channels. He logged the explanation without comment. That evening, he prepared a modest tasting service for a small group of early arrivals. The guests spoke in low tones about markets, acquisitions, territories. Their faces were familiar, though never publicly connected in the same room. Deals were implied, not announced. The meal was received with polite nods. After service, as he completed cleanup protocols, he observed something else. Waste disposal containers removed under escort, sealed before leaving the premises. No external sanitation company markings, no invoices visible. Staff quarters were located in a separate wing. Windows overlooked interior courtyards rather than the outside world. Internet access was filtered through monitored servers. As night settled across the estate, the surrounding forest swallowed all ambient sound. He stood briefly at a narrow window near the prep station and realized something unsettling. There was no visible neighboring light for miles, no traffic, no passing aircraft. An estate without an address does not expect visitors, and within its walls, operations moved with the efficiency of a system long perfected. A system that did not require explanation, only compliance. Somewhere inside that precision, something functioned quietly beyond the menu, and it had been functioning long before he arrived. The first time he saw it, it wasn't written down. It was spoken quietly, after the official service had ended and most of the visible staff had retreated to their quarters. One of the estate coordinators approached him with a single instruction. There will be a second seating. No printed menu followed. No tasting notes, no guest list, just a time. The primary dinner that evening had been elaborate but conventional. Aged beef, rare seafood, heritage vegetables flown in hours earlier. The kind of display expected when capital gathers in one room. Applause had been restrained but approving. This second seating was different. The coordinator handed him a small thermal container. Inside were vacuum-sealed portions of protein, labeled only by weight and a numeric batch code. No species identification, no supplier stamp, no inspection seal. He examined the texture through the plastic barrier. The grain was unfamiliar, dense but not in the way game meat presents. The color slightly darker than veal, lighter than venison. The fat distribution irregular. He asked where it had been sourced. The answer was immediate. Exclusive livestock, private reserve. He had worked with rare breeds before, heritage animals raised on controlled diets. But even those carried traceable documentation, veterinary clearances, agricultural certifications. There was always a paper trail. This had none. He prepared it cautiously. Slow sear, controlled internal temperature, minimalist seasoning to allow the protein's character to reveal itself. The aroma that rose from the pan was subtle, almost neutral. Not unpleasant, just different. When plated, it resembled fine dining at its most restrained. Small portions, surgical precision, no garnish that would distract. The guests for this seating entered without announcement. Only 6 of them. No staff remained in the dining hall beyond security stationed discreetly at the perimeter. He observed from the service entrance. The first bite was taken by an older man whose name had appeared in financial journals for decades. There was no visible reaction, no surprise, only a slow nod, as if confirming expectation. One of the guests asked, "Is this the new source?" The coordinator replied, "Yes. Fresh delivery." Fresh delivery. The language struck him. Not breed, not region, delivery. When the plates returned to the kitchen, they were clean. After cleanup, he searched the digital inventory system for the batch code. It did not appear in the main database. The procurement logs listed no corresponding shipment. Instead, there was a blank entry, a placeholder with restricted access. He attempted to access it, permission denied. Over the next week, the pattern repeated. Standard dinners documented thoroughly, secondary tastings unrecorded, proteins delivered through a side entrance after midnight. Security presence doubled during those deliveries. He began to document quietly. Weights, dates, event timing, cross-referencing quantities against guest attendance. The numbers did not align with conventional sourcing models. One evening, while trimming a portion under bright prep lights, he noticed something else. Structural characteristics inconsistent with livestock anatomy. The muscle fiber orientation was subtly distinct, the connective tissue patterns unfamiliar. He paused. Professional training teaches chefs to recognize an animal from a single cut. Years of repetition make it instinct. This cut did not match instinct. Behind him, a stainless steel door closed softly. He turned. No one stood there. But later that night, his workstation access code was reset without explanation. And from that point forward, he understood something clearly. There was a menu for the guests, and there was a menu that did not exist. One was printed for record, the other operated quietly, scheduled, delivered, consumed, without ever being acknowledged aloud. And whatever was being served in that second seating was not meant to be questioned, only prepared. It happened after midnight, not during service, not during the controlled choreography of plated courses and polished silver. It happened when the estate had settled into its curated stillness, when conversations had faded behind heavy doors, and the kitchen lights hummed against stainless steel. He told himself he was conducting a routine inventory audit. That was the justification. The numeric-coded refrigeration unit had remained sealed during standard prep hours, accessed only when secondary tastings were scheduled. Each time, the procurement liaison entered the code personally. Each time, security presence increased in subtle but measurable ways. That night, the liaison had left early, and the access panel remained active for 30 seconds longer than usual. He memorized the sequence. Hours later, alone in the kitchen, he approached the unit. The corridor cameras rotated slowly along their programmed arcs. He timed his movement between rotations, not to avoid them, but to avoid appearing hesitant. The keypad illuminated under his touch. The door seal released with a muted click. Cold air pressed outward, dense and metallic. Inside, the shelving was meticulously organized. Vacuum-sealed packages stacked in identical dimensions. No agricultural markings, no slaughterhouse identifiers, no traceability codes. He removed one package and placed it on the stainless counter beneath overhead light. The shape was wrong, not grotesque, not immediately obvious, but wrong in the way something is when familiarity fails by a fraction. He adjusted the packaging gently, rotating it. The cut was too symmetrical in one region, too anatomically specific in another. The bone fragment visible at one edge did not resemble bovine or porcine structure. The marrow cavity proportion was inconsistent with standard livestock anatomy. He had broken down whole animals before. He knew skeletal architecture intimately. This did not align. His pulse slowed instead of quickening, the response of someone trained to analyze before reacting. He examined the labeling more closely. Batch code, weight, date, no origin, no inspection stamp. He reached for his phone, hesitated, then activated the camera without flash. 2 photographs, close framing, no ambient background visible. A faint sound echoed down the corridor. Footsteps, measured, unhurried. He resealed the package, returning it precisely to its original position. closed the freezer door, wiped condensation from the handle. By the time the footsteps reached the threshold of the kitchen, he stood at the prep table reviewing produce inventory. A security officer entered. Routine check, he was told. But the officer's eyes lingered a second too long. The next morning, access protocols shifted. The numeric freezer required dual authentication. His clearance level remained unchanged. Officially. Unofficially, he sensed recalibration. Later that day, while cross-referencing regional news on a monitored workstation, a small article caught his attention. A missing persons report from a neighboring county. Adult. Last seen near a highway junction, less than 2 hours from the estate's private runway. No confirmed leads. He did not jump to conclusions. Professional discipline prevented that. Correlation is not confirmation, but he returned to the anatomical image stored on his phone. And for the first time since accepting the position, a realization formed with clinical clarity. If the supply chain could not be traced, if documentation did not exist, if the structure did not match livestock, then the source was something else, something unlisted, unregistered. The estate operated with precision too refined to be accidental. Deliveries arrived aligned with exclusive guest gatherings. Quantities matched attendance numbers with unsettling accuracy. Waste disposal left no irregular footprint. This was not improvisation. It was infrastructure. That evening, during standard dinner service, one of the 6 recurring guests watched him from across the room, longer than necessary. No smile, no acknowledgement, just observation, as if evaluating whether he had seen too much. In the cold room beneath industrial refrigeration units and coated locks, he had crossed an invisible threshold. And whatever had been preserved, there was not merely food. It was evidence. Evidence that something had been functioning behind those walls. Quietly, efficiently. Long before he memorized the keypad sequence. And now, it knew he had opened the door. He did not sleep the night after the cold room. Instead, he reconstructed patterns. Dates of secondary tastings. Weights of delivered portions. Guest attendance numbers. When mapped side by side, the alignment was too precise to dismiss. Quantities scaled proportionally to headcount. No surplus. No shortage. No standard commercial variance. This was not irregular sourcing. It was calculated provisioning. He understood that suspicion alone meant nothing. He needed expertise beyond culinary training. So he reached out carefully, not through his personal contacts, which could be traced, but through an encrypted email account created months earlier during the restaurant's financial collapse. The recipient was a forensic pathologist he had once met during a charity gala, a specialist who consulted on unidentified remains for regional authorities. The chef framed the inquiry clinically. No accusations, no conclusions. Just anatomical questions accompanied by cropped images, stripped of metadata. The reply came 48 hours later. The tone was restrained. The pathologist could not confirm species from photographs alone. However, certain structural characteristics visible in the images did not correspond to standard livestock commonly processed for consumption. The cortical bone density pattern appeared atypical. The message ended with a suggestion. If concerned, disengage. Do not investigate further without legal protection. Disengage. Inside the estate, operations continued uninterrupted. Deliveries still arrived after midnight through a service gate shielded from main surveillance corridors. The transport vehicles bore no company logos. Drivers never entered the kitchen. Containers were transferred under supervision and logged into a restricted digital ledger inaccessible to him. He began tracking external signals. Using estate-approved procurement terminals, he searched supplier databases for the numeric batch codes. No results. He cross-referenced agricultural registries. No matching entries. He analyzed freight routing patterns associated with nearby private airstrips. Then he noticed something subtle. The estate's waste management contracts were filed under a biomedical disposal classification, not commercial food service. The documentation was shielded under a subsidiary entity with ties to offshore holdings, biomedical disposal, for a private dining estate. He searched corporate registries linked to the shell company. The ownership trail dissolved into layered holding groups registered across multiple jurisdictions known for financial opacity. Directors listed were intermediaries, legal placeholders. This was not a rogue supplier, it was an engineered supply chain. Simultaneously, he monitored regional missing persons bulletins. Several cases shared geographic proximity to transit corridors leading toward the estate's airstrip. No immediate connections were publicized. No direct evidence tied those disappearances to anything beyond unfortunate circumstance. Yet timing aligned disturbingly close to certain private gatherings. Inside the kitchen, atmosphere shifted. Conversations shortened when he entered. Access credentials updated without explanation. His workstation privileges were subtly narrowed. The procurement liaison began supervising secondary tasting preparations personally, standing closer than necessary, observing knife technique with clinical interest. One evening during cleanup, he found his locker slightly ajar. Nothing appeared missing, but the alignment of his stored knives had changed. A quiet message. "We see you." The supply chain functioned with remarkable efficiency: sourcing, transport, processing, disposal, each compartmentalized. Each participant likely aware of only a fragment of the operation. A system designed not merely for discretion, but for insulation. And systems of that scale do not rely on chance. They rely on silence, financial leverage, and shared risk. As he stood alone reviewing shipment timestamps, he realized something critical. If the origin of the protein was what he feared, then it required coordination far beyond a single estate. It implied acquisition, containment, processing, and distribution protocols shielded by layers of influence, which meant exposure would not trigger simple denial. It would threaten infrastructure. Behind the chandeliers and curated guest lists, beyond the plated courses and controlled conversation, something larger was sustaining the illusion of refinement, a network operating without public footprint. And by tracing the supply chain, he had begun pulling at threads that did not belong to a kitchen. They belonged to power. It was no longer the freezer that unsettled him. It was the taste. He had trained his palate for decades, memorizing the mineral trace of grass-fed beef, the iron edge of venison, the delicate sweetness of young lamb. Flavor carried history, geography, diet, environment. But this carried something else. During the next secondary tasting, he was instructed to prepare the protein using minimal interference. "Let the integrity speak," the coordinator said. Integrity. He seared the portion carefully, monitoring internal temperature with exact precision. As it rested, he cut a thin sliver from the edge, a standard quality check any chef would perform before service. The texture yielded differently under the blade. He placed the sample on his tongue. The flavor was subtle, almost restrained. Slight metallic undertone, but not abnormal for red protein. The issue was not the taste itself, it was the familiarity. Somewhere in his sensory memory, recognition stirred, not from livestock, not from game, but from something studied in anatomy textbooks, from emergency culinary workshops where chefs trained alongside field medics for disaster response catering. There was a resonance in the muscle fiber, a composition that did not align with agricultural origin. He swallowed slowly. That was when the whisper began. Not audible, not dramatic. Just a quiet internal certainty that what he was preparing had once carried a pulse. He forced himself back into procedural focus. Plates assembled, portions aligned, sauce applied with restraint, no garnish to distract. The 6 guests arrived precisely at 11. This time, he did not observe openly. He watched through reflection, stainless steel surfaces catching fragments of movement from the dining hall. One guest, younger than the others, hesitated before the first bite. "Source confirmed?" he asked. The response from the coordinator was calm. "Verified." Verified. The word lingered long after service concluded. Later that night, alone in the staff corridor, he examined his hands under bright fluorescent light. He had washed them repeatedly as always. Yet he felt an unfamiliar weight. Not physical residue, but implication. If his suspicions were correct, he had already participated. Not knowingly, not intentionally. But participation does not require awareness to leave consequence. Over the following days, security presence intensified subtly. Additional patrols during off hours. Digital access logs reviewed more frequently. His communications terminal experienced brief outages at irregular intervals. He tested it by sending an innocuous email draft to himself. Delivery delayed by 6 hours. Someone was monitoring. One afternoon, as he prepared a standard luncheon menu, a senior guest entered the kitchen unannounced, a breach of the estate's usual protocol. The man studied him with clinical detachment. "You adapt quickly," the guest observed. A neutral statement. No accusation. Then came the question, "Does the flavor surprise you?" There was no humor in his expression. The chef answered carefully, "Every ingredient has a profile. My responsibility is to execute it properly." The guest held his gaze for several seconds longer than comfort allowed. Then he left. That evening, the numeric freezer required triple authentication. He stood alone in the prep area, long after shift completion, reviewing shipment schedules against regional news bulletins once more. Another disappearance had been reported, this time from a transit hub 2 counties away. No connection stated publicly, yet the delivery manifest showed a new batch arrival scheduled within 48 hours. The whisper in the blood was no longer internal speculation. It was pattern. Pattern in procurement timing, pattern in guest frequency, pattern in silence. Behind the estate's controlled elegance, something moved with deliberate rhythm. Acquisition followed by preparation, preparation followed by consumption, and the most disturbing realization was not the act itself. It was the normalization. The guests ate without visible reaction. Staff complied without open discussion. Systems operated without documentation, as if this had been happening long enough to feel routine. He understood then that discovery was only the first threshold. The greater danger was recognition, and the awareness that those who orchestrated the supply chain likely understood exactly when someone else had reached that same conclusion. The whisper in the blood did not fade. It grew clearer, and somewhere within the estate's layered security, that clarity was being measured. The town sat 12 miles from the estate's outer perimeter. A single main road, 2 gas stations, a grocery store that doubled as a post office. On paper, it was unremarkable. The kind of place where outsiders pass through without learning its name. But economically, it was tethered to the gates that never appeared on maps. The estate funded road maintenance, sponsored school renovations, donated to the sheriff's department annually through a private foundation. Local contractors handled landscaping, electrical repairs, and seasonal supply runs. Employment rotated quietly through service positions that required discretion clauses. No one asked detailed questions about what happened beyond the walls. They did not need to. The chef learned this gradually, through delivery drivers who kept conversations brief, through utility technicians who never lingered, through the subtle way people's posture shifted when the estate was mentioned. Dependence creates silence. On his one permitted day off each month, he was transported into town under supervision. The visit was structured: grocery stop, pharmacy, return. Still, it offered brief exposure to the outside world. It was there, inside the grocery store near a bulletin board layered with local notices, that he saw the first familiar face, a missing persons flyer. The photograph showed a man in his early 30s. Last seen traveling through the region, vehicle abandoned near a rural intersection less than 20 miles from the private runway. The date of disappearance aligned closely with one of the estate's secondary tastings. He did not photograph the flyer. Cameras were positioned near the entrance. Instead, he memorized the details: name, height, identifying marks. Later, back at the estate, he cross-referenced the timing with delivery logs. The correlation was precise. In town, no one spoke about the flyer openly. The cashier rang up groceries without comment. The sheriff's patrol car remained parked outside the diner, engine running. He began to notice other flyers in subsequent visits. Different faces, different dates, similar circumstances. Travelers, temporary workers, individuals with limited local ties, disappearances categorized as pending investigations. No public updates. When he casually asked a produce vendor whether the estate hosted many events, the man's expression tightened. "They keep to themselves," he said. "Good for the town." Good for the town. Funding flowed steadily. Infrastructure improved. Taxes remained low. The estate's presence insulated the region from economic decline that had hollowed neighboring counties. The sheriff's department received upgraded equipment the previous year, funded by a private donor, the same donor whose foundation was linked through layered filings to entities connected with the estate. It was legal, structured, transparent on paper, but transparency does not equal clarity. He researched public crime statistics during monitored workstation hours. Missing persons reports in surrounding counties showed a slight but consistent increase over the past 3 years. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would trigger national attention, just enough to register as unfortunate coincidence. Inside the estate, operations continued without disruption. Deliveries arrived, tastings occurred, waste removal proceeded under biomedical classification. Outside, the town attended football games and church services. Children rode bicycles past storefronts renovated through private grants. Life appeared stable. Stability discourages scrutiny. One evening, while reviewing archived local news, he found a brief article about a former kitchen assistant who had resigned abruptly months before his arrival. The report cited relocation for personal reasons, but no forwarding address was listed. He checked staff rosters. The assistant's name had been removed entirely from internal records. In town, no one mentioned him. It was as if absence dissolved into routine. A town that hears nothing often chooses not to listen. And when financial security depends on selective deafness, silence becomes communal. As he stood at the kitchen window that overlooked nothing but manicured inner courtyards, he understood something critical. The estate did not operate in isolation. It operated within a buffer, a community sustained just enough to avoid asking why private jets arrived at irregular hours, why deliveries bypassed public roads, why certain faces on bulletin boards never returned home. Behind the quiet streets and freshly painted storefronts, a different rhythm pulsed, one that never appeared in town meeting minutes. And as long as the gates remained closed and the funding remained steady, the town would continue hearing exactly what it was meant to hear. Nothing at all. He understood the difference between suspicion and proof. Suspicion lives in the mind. Proof survives scrutiny. If what he believed was true, then the estate was not merely violating ethics. It was sustained by architecture designed to withstand exposure. Financial insulation, legal insulation, operational insulation. To challenge that, he would need more than photographs and intuition. He began with duplication. Every shipment that entered under restricted classification passed briefly through a digital checkpoint before disappearing into segmented logs. During those seconds, metadata flickered across the procurement dashboard. Timestamps, routing IDs, encrypted vendor codes. He memorized patterns. Over several weeks, he reconstructed partial shipment identifiers from memory, entering fragments into external corporate registries during approved workstation access periods. Most searches returned nothing, but occasionally a code matched a dormant logistics company registered offshore, entities that listed biomedical waste processing as their primary function. Biomedical, for a private culinary estate. He documented each match by hand in a small notebook he kept concealed inside the lining of his knife roll. No digital trail, no screenshots that could be traced back to monitored systems. Next, he turned to timing. Secondary tastings occurred roughly every 3 to 5 weeks, often aligning with unpublicized arrivals of specific recurring guests. Within 48 hours prior to those gatherings, delivery manifests showed new restricted inventory entries. He cross-referenced these dates with publicly accessible missing persons databases during his structured town visits, using a public library terminal rather than estate equipment. The alignment was not perfect, but it was consistent enough to disturb. He avoided dramatic conclusions. Patterns require repetition to establish significance. By the fifth documented correlation, the statistical improbability narrowed. Meanwhile, internal conditions shifted. Security personnel rotated more frequently. The procurement liaison began standing closer during preparation of restricted proteins, observing knife angles and portioning with unnatural attention. His access credentials required revalidation twice within 1 week, an unusual frequency compared to earlier months. He sensed recalibration again, so he escalated carefully. Through the encrypted email channel previously used to contact the forensic pathologist, he reached out to an investigative journalist known for long-form financial crime reporting. He provided no accusations, only structured data points. Shipment timestamps, shell company registrations, biomedical disposal contracts, geographic clusters of disappearances. The journalist responded cautiously. The information, while circumstantial, indicated potential financial irregularities worth examining. Offshore holdings tied to private estates often mask tax avoidance or regulatory circumvention. The chef did not correct the assumption. He understood that financial scrutiny often opens doors that moral outrage cannot. Inside the estate, tension thickened. One evening after concluding standard dinner service, he discovered his workstation drawer slightly open. Though he distinctly remembered closing it, the concealed notebook remained in place, but it had been moved, not taken. Moved. A signal. 2 days later, his communications terminal experienced a 12-hour outage. IT staff attributed it to routine system maintenance. Yet no other department reported interruption. He accelerated documentation. He discreetly copied publicly accessible procurement summaries onto a small encrypted drive purchased during a town visit. He avoided estate networks entirely, transferring only information he had recorded manually. The evidence was incomplete. Fragments of a larger structure, but fragments can establish trajectory. As he reviewed his compiled notes late one night, he confronted a difficult truth. If exposure succeeded, it would not only implicate unnamed guests, it would implicate him. He had prepared the meals, executed the plating, facilitated the service. Intent would matter legally, but perception could distort intent. He paused, considering whether to abandon the effort and leave quietly. Yet departure required clearance, and clearance required explanation, and explanations invited scrutiny. Beyond the kitchen walls, operations continued with unwavering precision. Deliveries arrived. Tastings were scheduled. Waste removal vehicles departed under escort. The system had not faltered, but somewhere within its circuitry, a variable had emerged. Him. And as he gathered evidence piece by piece, he could no longer ignore the possibility that the estate was also gathering evidence of him, measuring his movements, tracking deviations, calculating risk. Because institutions built to protect secrets rarely wait for exposure. They anticipate it. It was the culmination of weeks of observation, documentation, and silent calculation. He had prepared countless meals for the estate's elite, but tonight was different. The secondary tasting, the one unrecorded in logs, unacknowledged in digital inventories, had been scheduled weeks in advance. The shipment arrived late in the evening, discreetly, under security escort. No one outside the inner circle would know it existed. He inspected the packages again. The texture, the weight, the subtle irregularities that had unsettled him weeks ago, all present. He did not touch them as usual. He did not pre-plate. Tonight he was not the chef alone. He was also the observer, the investigator, the custodian of evidence. Every step had to be precise, every motion deliberate. Any miscalculation could alert security or the guest to his awareness. He meticulously prepared a substitute for the main ingredient. Only he and the sous chef were aware. The substitution was unremarkable to the untrained eye. Imported beef, meticulously selected, seasoned with restraint. As he carried plates into the dining hall, the guests arrived. 6 of them, their faces familiar from previous visits. But tonight they appeared sharper, almost anticipatory. Security officers stood at precise intervals, their presence subtle but unmistakable. Cameras monitored from high angles, the lenses reflecting faint light off the polished floors. The meal began. Plates moved smoothly from kitchen to table. He observed from the side of the room as the guests tasted. The first bite, silence. No nod of approval, no comment, just careful observation. The younger guest, the one who had asked about the flavor weeks ago, paused slightly longer before taking a second bite. He looked toward the coordinator. Different, he said softly. The coordinator's response was measured. Subtle variation, prepared per protocol. The phrasing struck him. Protocol. Not taste, not tradition. Protocol. The language was deliberate. The meal continued, each dish executed with the precision of a high-level kitchen, yet beneath the surface, tension grew. Every guest was watching, every security officer vigilant. The chef felt the weight of countless unseen eyes, cameras, sensors, staff, all measuring, noting, calculating. When the last plate returned, the room was quiet. The guests lingered at the table longer than expected, discussing matters inaudible to him. A final nod from the coordinator, and the guests departed in silence. He returned to the kitchen, heart still pounding. The substitution had gone unnoticed. The restricted ingredient remained untouched, sealed, and returned to the cold room. He photographed it discreetly for records, careful to avoid detection. But the realization settled in immediately. Tonight had changed everything. By substituting the protein, he had broken the unspoken cycle. The estate's system, flawless for months, had been challenged, if only for a moment. Shortly after service, security requested his presence. Not formally, but enough to communicate awareness. "Your access will be adjusted," a liaison said, voice calm, professional. No further explanation. He understood. The estate had noticed. The system was assessing him, measuring his compliance, determining whether he was a risk. As he packed tools for the night, he glanced at the cold room door. Behind it lay the ingredient he had deliberately bypassed. The packages gleamed under the harsh fluorescent light. Evidence, proof, and danger, all in one. He realized then that tonight had been more than a meal. It had been a confrontation, a test, a boundary drawn quietly, without words, within the estate's perfectly orchestrated ecosystem. And somewhere, beyond the chandeliers, beyond the private gates, beyond the eyes of the guests who would never speak of it, the system had registered that someone inside had begun to act. The night of service was over, but the consequences had only just begun. The estate did not change, not visibly, not in the ways the world could see. The gates remained closed. Security patrols continued on the same precise schedule. Cameras rotated along the same programmed arcs. Deliveries arrived under the same silent supervision. To the outside observer, the estate functioned as if nothing had shifted, but inside, the atmosphere had altered. He felt it in subtle calibrations. A hand lingering slightly longer over a knife during prep, a subtle increase in dual authentication requests, a new requirement for every shipment's signature to be verified twice before processing. The system had noticed. It had adapted, and he understood clearly that he was now a variable within it, a component to be monitored and assessed. He did not continue service after that night. Access was quietly revoked under the pretext of staffing rotation and scheduling conflicts. His instructions were formal but thin, a notice of reassignment to administrative tasks, though he knew those tasks were carefully limited and monitored. Once removed from the kitchen, he had time to reflect. He reviewed his documentation, shipment times, numeric batch codes, guest attendance, anomalies in protein sourcing, and overlapping regional disappearance reports. He compiled the notes, photographs, and cross-references into a secure package. The journalist he had contacted weeks earlier was still communicating cautiously, offering guidance on safe channels for submission. They agreed to publish only when enough corroboration existed to withstand scrutiny. Offshore company filings, procurement data, and public records had to align. The story could not be speculative. It had to be factual, defensible, and incontrovertible. Weeks passed, months even. The estate continued its operations as before, and the external world remained unaware. Publicly, the property was another symbol of wealth and prestige. Private, discreet, impeccably maintained. Privileged guests dined, investments were brokered, contracts signed, and the invisible cycles that had once delivered untraceable protein remained operational. But there were signs of disruption. Ownership of several shell companies linked to supply and disposal chains quietly shifted. A few high-profile individuals associated with the estate resigned from unrelated boards and foundations. Regulatory filings emerged that subtly contradicted previously held information. No formal charges were announced. No public disclosure of wrongdoing occurred. The chef vanished from culinary circles. The city's elite kitchens no longer listed him. Old contacts had been warned off. He assumed a new identity professionally, maintaining only enough presence to survive. His story existed primarily in fragments, recorded in encrypted channels and personal notebooks he stored off-site. For the journalists, the expose was published months later. It presented the estate as a hub of financial opacity, highlighting shell corporations, offshore logistics, and unusual procurement patterns. There was careful avoidance of speculation regarding the protein itself. The story focused on verifiable financial and operational anomalies. Yet beneath the formal reporting, attentive readers could sense the shadowed layer of activity that no public record acknowledged. Some investigations reopened. Authorities quietly reviewed previously cold cases in surrounding counties, cross-referencing disappearance timelines with transport corridors leading to private airstrips. Nothing conclusive emerged, but patterns were noted, filed for further review. He never returned to that world, not officially, but the memory remained, not only of what he had witnessed, but of the feeling of systems functioning beyond observation, of invisible chains operating quietly behind gates, polished floors, and chandeliers. He had entered seeking opportunity to reclaim a career. Instead, he had glimpsed a hidden rhythm, a world that consumed without explanation, operated without oversight, and judged without announcement. And as he reflected, he understood something that would remain with him indefinitely. Power rarely leaves fingerprints. It leaves systems. And the system at the estate, built over years of secrecy, precision, and unspoken rules, continued quietly, unbroken, undisclosed, and waiting. The aftermath was not about closure. It was about survival.